All right, so today we're going deep on a philosopher who kind of set the stage for a lot of 20th century thought.
Okay.
And might really resonate with anyone out there, really into philosophical inquiry. His name is Nicolai Hartmann.
All right, Nicolai Hartmann.
Born in 1882, died in 1950.
Okay.
And he's interesting because he started out like right in the thick of Neo-Kantianism.
Yeah.
But then carved out this path back to ontology.
Right.
The study of being.
The study of being.
And he had this, real drive to try to bridge some of these, major philosophical divides.
Yeah, absolutely. And, for someone deep into philosophical inquiry,
Right.
Hartmann's project is really compelling because he wasn't, just messing around with the edges of existing systems.
Right.
He was going for this, robust, pluralistic realism that could actually speak to both, the sciences and the humanities. It was a huge undertaking.
Yeah, exactly. And as you dig into his work,
Yeah.
you see this incredible breadth. He was deep into philosophy of history, epistemology, like how do we know what we know, ethics, aesthetics. But at the core, like we're going to unpack today, was this real fascination with ontology.
Right.
With understanding, the fundamental structures of reality itself.
Yes, yes. And what I think is particularly interesting for, folks into philosophy is his method.
Okay.
So Hartmann was known for this like super rigorous step-by-step analysis. It wasn't about building these big prefab systems.
Yeah.
He was all about independent thought.
Yeah.
Like, famously, he used these disputation circles to get his students to really think for themselves and come to their own conclusions.
Yeah, which is something, any serious philosopher can appreciate.
Absolutely.
So our goal today in this deep dive is to pull out some of the really, key insights from Hartmann's work.
Okay.
The ideas that are still, fresh and potentially challenging.
Yeah.
For, the fundamental philosophical questions that we're all wrestling with.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's start with like a real building block here.
Okay.
The relationship between thinking and being.
All right, so this is where I think Hartmann's really unique approach starts to come together. So he begins with this, big nod to Kant.
Okay.
Recognizing that, experience throws us these real problems that reason just can't fully solve on its own.
Right.
Think about those classic Kantian antinomies.
Yeah.
And Hartmann takes this seriously.
Yeah.
He says, look, there are some built-in limits to how much we can really get at the, the fundamental nature of being just through pure reason.
Right. And so he builds on that with this idea of problem consciousness.
Okay. Problem consciousness.
And he argues that just the fact that we're aware of these, persistent, these really deep philosophical problems, not just everyday puzzles, but the deep stuff, that actually points to an underlying ontological reality. That the fact that we're still wrestling with these questions and that we can see some kind of cognitive progress in how we're understanding them suggests that there's something real there that we're trying to, grapple with.
That we're trying to get at.
Yeah. And his metaphysics of cognition is super important here.
Okay.
Where he argues that any epistemology, any theory of knowledge is ultimately built on ontological assumptions about what is.
Okay, yeah, that's a really important foundation to set.
Yeah.
Because Hartmann very deliberately positions his critical epistemology in relation to idealism and naive realism.
Right.
So idealism, is the view that thinking kind of creates reality.
Yeah.
And naive realism is the idea that perception gives us this direct pipeline straight to reality.
Unmediated.
Yeah. And so he's saying, look, I'm not on board with either of those.
Right.
He advocates for this kind of epiche.
Okay.
This temporary suspension of those big theoretical commitments, at least when we're starting an inquiry.
Okay. So we're bracketing those big pronouncements.
Exactly.
Stepping back and really looking at the phenomenon of cognition itself.
Yeah.
Okay. And that leads him to this really interesting way of understanding what a problem is.
Okay.
So he breaks it down into three parts.
Right.
The problem stelling.
Problems.
Which is the way we actually formulate the problem, which can be, pretty dependent on context.
Right. Yeah.
And then the problem lash.
Okay.
Which is the current state of the problem, kind of more stable, but still influenced by, historical stuff.
Yeah.
And then the problem galt.
Problem galt.
The core content of the problem.
Okay. The core content.
Which he suggests can even have these non-rational aspects to it.
Interesting. So he's saying that the core of a philosophical problem
Yeah.
might not even be fully graspable
Yeah.
by reason alone.
Right. And what's really insightful for, philosophers, is that he argues that this problem called is transhistorical.
Okay, transhistorical. So it stretches across.
Yeah, it's rooted in the fundamental structure of the world.
Okay.
And our place within it.
Mm-hmm.
So the way we frame the problem, the way we understand it right now, that might change across history.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that core issue.
That persists.
Persists, yeah. And I think that's a really helpful way to look at philosophical debates.
Right.
It's not just that we haven't found the right answer yet.
Yeah.
It's that there's this, constant underlying challenge that we're engaging with in different ways across time.
Right. It's not just that we're, dumb and haven't figured it out yet.
Exactly.
There's something there.
Right.
Okay. And this connects with how he interprets Kant's, supreme principle.
Right.
That the conditions for the possibility of experience are also the conditions for the possibility of the objects of experience. Mm-hmm. And Hartmann saw this as this restricted identity thesis between subject and object.
Okay, a restricted identity?
Not total merging.
Yeah.
But not complete separation either.
Huh.
Right. Right. And this is where Hartmann, really starts to diverge from Kant's idealist reading.
Okay.
So Kant thought these conditions were like internal to the knowing subject, right? That they were part of us. Mm-hmm. But Hartmann sees this as potentially limiting.
Okay.
He proposes this realist alternative.
Right.
That these conditions for experience, these principles, they're not just in us, they're in the broader reality.
Okay.
That both the subject and the object are part of.
Right. So both are structured by these.
Yeah, by these shared ontological principles.
And he calls these what?
Categories.
Categories. Okay. So it's not the mind, imposing structure on this like formless world.
Right.
But it's not just the world perfectly imprinting on our minds either.
Exactly.
It's this shared underlying framework.
Yeah, it's like there's a structure to reality itself.
Okay.
And both mind and world kind of participate in that.
Okay. And this sets the stage for his philosophical methodology.
Right.
Which is really interesting.
Yeah, a three-pronged approach that really emphasizes rigor.
Okay, so break it down for us.
All right, so first you have phenomenological description.
Okay.
Which is basically gathering all the evidence you can about whatever you're looking at, but without jumping to theoretical conclusions too soon.
Right.
Just really careful observation.
Okay.
Then there's aporetics.
Aporetics.
Which is systematically identifying the conflicts and the aporias that pop up when you're looking at this evidence.
Right.
And crucially, Hartmann didn't see these aporias as failures.
Yeah.
He thought they were super valuable insights.
Really?
Yeah, he thought they showed us how complex being really is.
Yeah.
So they're not things to brush under the rug.
Okay, the aporia as a point of leverage.
A point of leverage, exactly.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, and then what's the third prong?
Okay, so the third stage is theoretical development. And that's where you build your explanations.
Right.
But you got to coordinate them with the findings from the first two phases and stick to this rule of minimal metaphysical assumptions.
Okay.
So keep it as lean as possible.
Right. Don't get too speculative.
Exactly.
Okay. And this is where his distinction between ontology and metaphysics gets really important.
Right, right. Because for Hartmann, ontology is about the parts of being that we can at least potentially understand through our categories.
Okay.
Whereas metaphysics deals with the stuff that's just not rational. Mm-hmm. The non-cognizable parts of reality.
The stuff that's, maybe beyond our grasp.
Exactly.
Okay, and here's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
He considered science.
Yeah.
All science, natural and social.
Right.
To be fundamentally ontological.
Yeah, at its core.
Which I think is really interesting and might surprise some people.
Yeah, it's a different way of thinking about science.
Right, that it's not just about, figuring out how things work.
Yeah.
But it's about investigating being.
Yeah.
Okay, you mentioned earlier this thing about grasping.
Right.
From metaphysics of cognition.
Yeah, grasp.
Can you talk a little more about that and how that illustrates his method?
Yeah, absolutely. So, just from a phenomenological perspective, right? When we think about cognition, we have this experience of grasping an object that seems to be out there independent of us.
Right. Something we didn't just invent.
Yeah, exactly. And that immediately creates an aporia.
Okay.
How can our minds, which seem to be, self-contained, reach out and grab something that's transcendent?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Right. And an idealist might try to get around this by saying, oh, well, the mind is actually unconsciously creating its objects.
Yeah.
But Hartmann's like, no, that doesn't do justice to this very real feeling of being confronted by something outside of ourselves.
Yeah, like that feeling of encountering something new.
Yeah.
Or something that resists our will.
Exactly. And so to explain this transcendence, Hartmann goes back to Kant's idea of the thing in itself.
Okay.
But he tweaks it.
Okay.
He doesn't think of it as this, like, unknowable entity in some separate realm.
Right.
He sees it as a key concept for understanding this act of grasping.
Okay.
It's the recognition that the object we grasp, the appearance,
yeah,
might have aspects that are, unknown to us right now,
right,
which he calls transobjective,
okay,
or even aspects that are like fundamentally non-rational,
okay,
transintelligible.
And so our very problem consciousness, right, that awareness of the limits of our knowledge is implicitly acknowledging this transobjective dimension.
It's like pointing to this real relationship between a knowing subject and something that exists independently.
Okay, so thinking isn't creating being.
Right.
It's this active engagement with it, this attempt to try to understand something that's ultimately bigger than our, immediate rational capacities.
Exactly. And as Hartmann puts it, thinking is immanent to being, not the other way around.
Right.
The rationale is like embedded in this much wider sphere of the non-rational.
Totally embedded.
And it's worth pointing out that Heidegger, in Being and Time, he actually echoes this move to like ground epistemology and ontology.
Interesting.
And even mentions Hartmann on this point.
Wow, so there's some convergence there.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've dug into his understanding of thinking and being.
Right.
Now let's shift gears to his ethics and aesthetics.
Okay.
And this really fundamental question of, what is value?
Yeah.
And what does that tell us about humanity's place in the world?
Right. So Hartmann argues that before we can even talk about ethical rules or obligations, like what should we do, we need to answer a more basic question.
What's that?
What is valuable?
Okay.
He thought that the whole Kantian focus on duty assumes we already understand what we consider valuable.
Right.
What's worth striving for.
Okay.
So for Hartmann, ethics is really about figuring out the ends of our actions. Wow. And those ends are value.
Values, okay.
And he was pretty critical of Kant's, ethical formalism and intellectualism. He was more drawn to Aristotle's virtue ethics.
Okay.
And especially Max Scheller's moral realism.
Moral realism. So the idea that
values have a real existence, independent of our opinions about them.
Right. They're not just subjective preferences.
Exactly.
Okay.
But Hartmann, he takes this idea from Scheller, but develops it in his own way. He says we have this a priori intuitive capacity to discern values.
Interesting. So he thinks it's built in.
Yeah. He points to things like moral exemplarity.
Like we admire heroes.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Our admiration for moral heroes.
Right.
And our ability to be self-critical.
Yeah, we can judge ourselves.
Right. And he says that's evidence that we have this sense of values.
Okay, but it's not pure intuitionism, right?
No.
No, it's not just like gut feeling.
It's not just gut feeling.
Yeah.
He emphasized that moral life is this dynamic process.
Okay.
We got to carefully discern values and do this creative synthesis.
Especially when there are conflicts.
Which
is like inevitable.
Yeah, it's unavoidable.
Yeah.
So it's not about finding the perfect theoretical solution.
It's navigating these tensions.
Exactly.
And he uses this metaphor of a spotlight.
Oh, yeah, the spotlight metaphor.
To explain how our, awareness and ranking of values changes across history and cultures.
Across time and place.
But the core content of the values themselves stays the same.
Yeah, so it's like our value consciousness is a spotlight shining on different parts of this big realm of trans-historical values.
Okay.
So our culture, our personal development, those things influence what we see and what we focus on.
Right.
But the basic values themselves, those don't change.
Okay, so that's how he kind of threads the needle between absolutism and relativism.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. And you mentioned earlier these two principles.
Yeah.
Strength and height.
Strength and height.
Can you talk a little bit more about how those work together?
Yeah, so the strength of a value. Okay.
For Hartmann is all about how bad it is to violate it.
Okay.
So the stronger the value, the worse the transgression.
Right.
Height, on the other hand, is about the moral worth you get from realizing a value.
Okay.
From living it out.
So if you fulfill that value.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that these two principles often work in opposite directions.
Really?
Yeah. So the most basic, the strongest values Those tend to be the lowest in height.
Okay.
And the highest, the most refined values. Those are often the weakest.
Okay.
In terms of immediate consequences if you fail to realize them.
Interesting. So, like, basic values are kind of simple.
Yeah.
And high values are more complex.
Yeah, nuanced.
Okay. So give me an example.
Okay. So, like, violating a basic value, like respect for life.
Yeah.
That's a huge offense.
Right.
But just following that rule doesn't make you a saint.
Right.
Right.
Okay.
But realizing a really high spiritual value.
Yeah.
That could be super meritorious.
Yeah.
But failing to do it
might not seem like this huge moral failure.
Right. Okay, so it's kind of a sliding scale.
Yeah, and Hartmann stressed the importance of a balanced system of values.
Okay.
Where the higher values are built on a foundation of respect for the lower ones.
Okay, so you can't have the high without the low.
Right, like you can't pursue justice without any compassion.
Right, that would be out of whack.
Exactly.
And he also talked about the tensions between values.
Yes, these value antinomies and conflicts.
Right.
Like when justice clashes with personal love.
Yeah.
Those are tough situations.
And he warns about this danger of, like, fetishizing individual values.
Yeah, putting one on a pedestal.
At the expense of others.
Right.
And he says the key is synthesis.
Synthesis, yeah.
Finding ways to integrate these seemingly opposing values.
Like his famous phrase, loving justice, just love.
Loving justice, just love. Okay, so it's about holding those two together.
Exactly.
And that leads to his really unique take on freedom.
Right. He calls it personal autonomy.
Okay. Personal autonomy.
And he sees it as this separate kind of determination, different from both natural causality and moral obligation.
So we're not just puppets of physics or, moral law.
Right, exactly. For Hartmann, freedom isn't about being uncaused.
Yeah.
It's about our ability to choose which values we align ourselves with.
Okay.
And make those values the driving force in our actions.
So we become mediators of the ought, as he put it.
Exactly. We're not just following orders.
We're bringing those values into reality.
Right.
I think that's a super compelling perspective on free will.
Absolutely. It's a very active view of freedom.
Okay. And this led him to critique teleological metaphysics.
Yeah, the idea that the universe has a built-in purpose.
Yeah, some predetermined goal.
Right. Hartmann argues that real morality requires us to be delivered from the nightmare of teleology.
Wow. The nightmare of teleology.
Yeah, because if the universe is already good, or headed towards some ultimate good,
then our efforts are meaningless.
Then what are we doing here?
Right. So he's saying our significance as humans comes from our ability to bring value into a world that isn't inherently meaningful.
Right, a world that needs us.
That's a pretty powerful statement about human agency and responsibility.
Yeah, it's a big responsibility.
Okay, so how does aesthetics fit into all this?
So for Hartmann, creating and appreciating art, that's a prime example of humans adding meaning to the world.
Okay.
Aesthetic values give us this sense of encountering something intrinsically valuable, something that enriches our lives.
Yeah.
And like his ethics and his epistemology, his aesthetics, has this strong ontological basis.
Okay.
He focused on the aesthetic object itself and made a distinction between the foreground, which is the sensible stuff.
Like what you see in here?
Yeah, like the physical artwork. And the background.
Okay.
Which is unreal.
Unreal.
Yeah, but it's still apprehended.
Okay.
It exists for the person experiencing the art.
Okay, so it's not part of the object itself.
Yeah, right. It's like a layer of meaning that we bring to it.
Interesting.
So the artist is playing with this relationship of appearance between the foreground and the background.
Okay.
And that's where aesthetic values like beauty come from.
So beauty isn't just in the object itself.
Right. It's in how we experience it.
In the relationship.
Yeah, in the whole interaction.
Okay.
And Hartmann had some really interesting takes on things like the sublime.
Oh, yeah.
Grounding it in human aspiration rather than in some transcendental realm like Kant did.
So he brings it back down to earth?
Yeah, he's all about human experience.
Okay.
And he spent a lot of time thinking about comedy and music.
Interesting.
And his theory of the stratified background in aesthetics is really detailed and insightful.
Okay, what's this stratified background?
So it's like the different levels of meaning and representation you find in a work of art.
Like in a novel?
Yeah, like a novel or a painting. There are all these layers.
Layers of meaning.
Yeah, and Hartmann was really good at unpacking those.
Interesting. Okay, so both ethics and aesthetics for Hartmann point to this key role of humans.
Yeah.
We're the ones who bring meaning and value to the world.
A world that doesn't have them inherently.
Right.
Which is pretty significant place to occupy.
It is, yeah.
And this leads to his philosophical anthropology, which is kind of spread throughout his work.
Yeah.
He didn't write a specific book on it, but it's there. He saw humans as these stratified beings.
Stratified.
Yeah, with physical, biological, psychological, and spiritual dimensions.
Okay.
Which reflects the stratified structure of reality itself.
Right. So we're microcosms of the macrocosm.
Yeah, exactly.
And he was trying to find this middle ground between naturalism and idealism. Yeah.
Recognizing that we're dependent on the lower levels, but also have these higher capacities.
Like creativity and morality.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about thinking and being value humanity's place. Now let's get to the heart of his project.
Okay.
What did Hartmann think the structure of reality actually is?
Right, so that's where his big book, Ontology, Laying the Foundations, comes in.
Ontology. Laying the foundations.
Yeah, this is where he really lays it all out. Okay. His main argument is that all these ontological distinctions, they come from categories.
Categories.
Not from this split between being and non-being.
Okay.
So everything that exists, parts and wholes, independent and dependent things, physical, biological, psychological, spiritual, they're all equally real. They're just different ways that being is determined.
Okay, so no level is like more real than another.
Right.
Even if some levels depend on others.
Exactly.
And at the center of all this is his theory of categories.
Categories.
And he makes a real distinction between categories and concepts.
Right. Unlike Kant or Hegel.
So what's the difference?
So for Hartmann, categories aren't just how our minds organize the world. They're like baked into reality.
Okay.
They're universal and necessary determinations of being itself.
Okay.
He calls it the sosane.
The sosane.
The being such and such a way.
Okay.
So they specify the inherent structure, the content of entities.
Okay.
It's not just how we think about them, it's how they are.
So for Kant, categories are in the mind.
Yeah.
But for Hartmann?
They're in the world. They're immanent.
Immanent to the world.
Yeah, they're like the interior of things.
Okay. And how are they organized?
He saw them as having this core periphery structure.
Okay.
The most fundamental ones are at the core.
The core.
And then they kind of radiate outwards.
Okay.
He also divided them into modal categories, fundamental categories, and special categories.
Okay. And we learn about these how?
Through the objects we encounter.
Okay.
But our knowledge is always provisional.
Okay.
You know, our concepts are just partial static snapshots of these dynamic, interconnected categories.
Okay, so we're always catching glimpses.
Yeah, we're getting closer.
But never the full picture.
Right, and these categories have two main aspects.
Okay.
Generality and determination.
Okay.
Which makes them function as principles.
Okay, principles.
And these principles only exist in relation to what he calls the concretum.
The concretum.
The concrete thing they're determining.
Okay, so the principle can't exist on its own.
No, it has to be a principle of something.
Okay.
They're like the archai, the foundations of the things they determine.
And what are some examples of these fundamental categories?
Okay, so he talks about the principle concretum relation itself. And the element complex relation. Okay. Where complexes are these things made of parts.
Yeah.
And the parts are defined by their role in the complex.
Like organs in a body.
Exactly. Or individuals in a society.
Okay.
The parts make sense because of the whole.
Right. And he makes this distinction between Sosane and Dasein.
Yeah. So Sosane is determination.
Determination.
And Dasein is existence.
Existence, okay.
And he sees those as like fundamental ways of being, rather than sticking with that traditional essence-existence split.
Right, so it's not that old chestnut.
No, he's moving beyond that.
Okay.
He sees them as positional.
Positional.
Yeah, so like the Dasein of one thing can be the Sosane of a bigger thing.
Okay.
And vice versa.
So they're relative.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, and then there's his theory of strata. These levels of reality.
Yeah, so you've got the inanimate, the biological, the psychological, and the spiritual.
Okay, and each of these levels
has its own set of categories.
Right, its own rules.
Yeah, and he stresses that all these levels are equally real.
Okay.
They're just structured differently.
And what kind of relationships are there between these levels?
Okay, so he talks about two main types.
All right.
Superformation.
Superformation.
Which is when patterns from a lower level get integrated into a higher level.
Okay, like molecules forming cells.
Exactly. And then there's superposition.
That's superposition.
Which is more like a break in the chain.
Okay.
When something new emerges.
Like what?
Like the relationship between the psychological and the spiritual.